Right at the very start, nobody knew how serious this would eventually become and what a big story it was going to be.
She was just the same young person that I was, who came to Glasgow looking for some adventures and to earn a little bit of extra money.
When Angelika disappeared, she'd left her passport and her personal belongings in her room. Where was she?
Fears are growing for the safety of a young Polish woman who's been missing for 3 days.
When a member of your family actually goes missing, it's 20 times worse than death, because you do not know a thing.
With Dinah missing for more than 5 months, police fear she's either dead or has been persuaded to join a religious sect and is being held against her will.
Nobody knew what had happened with Vicky. She had literally just vanished off the face of the earth. She just was at the bus stop 1 minute and then wasn't at the bus stop. Back then I knew that that was it. Life had changed forever.
These crimes get beneath the skin of the public consciousness and they stay there. There were so many sad twists and turns, things you were never prepared for.
Why is she in a back garden 400 miles away?
They'd already found one body at this home in Margate. Today, another has been unearthed.
Please be Dinah.
And I think that encapsulated the cruelty of Peter Tobin for me. How bad would things have to be that you would hope your daughter was in a murderer's back garden?
Margaret Thatcher is resigning as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. She told her cabinet, it's a funny old world.
And liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope, our window on the universe.
Within the last hour, President Gorbachev has resigned. He was going with hope and no regrets.
The leaders of the new Germany have pledged to work for European unity and world peace.
George Square was mobbed as the biggest street party in Britain ended with a bang.
In the 1990s, you know, there was a greater sense of freedom and hope, and people were living their best lives, even in cities like Glasgow.
In the 90s, as a young woman...
But first there's lunchtime.
I actually felt very bullish about the future. Yes, you encountered sexism every single day, but you were able to challenge that.
That'll do us.
And so it felt like forward movement.
I think there were lots of young women who were out and about and, you know, determined to kind of have a great freedom in our lives, which was fantastic.
Whether we were being naive in that, I don't know. Time would maybe suggest that we were, but the feeling was a fairly positive and progressive feeling.
Back then, it was both a more innocent time and a more dangerous time, I think, for young women. There were predators preying on women, particularly young women, and it was much more difficult to catch them.
Britain wakes up to a blanket of snow and the inevitable chaos on the roads and the railways.
The Arctic weather spread overnight to most parts of the country. It's badly affected road, rail and air travel, and the motoring organisations are warning drivers of hazardous conditions.
February 1991 was a very, very cold month, and the 10th of February, I remember it well, Sunday, the 10th of February 1991, was bitterly cold. I got a call very late on that night, that Sunday night, to say that there was a 15-year-old girl called Vicky Hamilton who had gone missing from the bus stop in the main street of Bathgate. So I was called as the divisional commander to authorise searches and overtime and call-outs of people to try and search for Vicky.
Vicky was my big sister. She was a wonderful person. Always remember in her room she had music posters up. Madonna, she was a huge fan of Madonna, and she used to like singing and dancing, and she used to dance to Queen, and she used to love New Kids on the Block, who were quite big at that time. So I remember she used to listen to that kind of stuff, and she loved her makeup. And I typical little child used to try and sneak into a room and steal her stuff, which meant I was never allowed into a room. But there was loads of good memories in that household before everything changed.
The first 24 hours in any crime, any serious crime, missing persons, murders, hugely important. I mean, they call it the golden 24 hours for a reason. That's your chance to get a grip of the evidence and to get off on the right foot. The problem with missing persons is that often they are not treated seriously enough in that first 24 to 48 hours. And it's only after 48 hours that somebody rings the panic bell and says, hang on a minute, this person's missing, and we think something could have happened to them. That didn't happen with Vicky, and she was treated as a vulnerable missing person right from the get-go.
Police inquiries are being extended and 100 officers are conducting extensive roadside searches.
She was a child without any background of running away from home or truancy. It's very clear, because of the weather and because of what we already knew about Vicky, that something awful had befallen her, because it just was not like her to disappear like that.
On February the 10th, 1991, Vicky was 15 and me and my twin brother Lee were 6 years, 5 months. I do remember the house in Ward Avenue, and I remember my brother and Vicky and my mum being a very close-knit unit, and we had a dog called Patch. It was a very happy household, loads of singing, dancing, listening to music. Mum was a big Queen fan. Sharon is my sister, Vicky's big sister. She was the person who Vicky had went to go and stay with that weekend in Livingston.
Vicky Hamilton disappeared from Bathgate town centre on February 10th. She was last seen waiting for a bus for her home in Falkirk, having spent the weekend with her sister in Livingston.
Well, she left Livingston. She was okay. I mean, she wasn't down about anything.
My mum couldn't drive, so Vicky had to make her own way.
She was happy, you know, she had a smile on her face.
She got on the bus at Livingston. Sharon saw her off. She got to Bathgate, fine. She was seen at Bathgate going into a fish and chip shop before our next bus. She never got onto that bus from Falkirk. She vanished from that bus stop. The next day morning, it was really bitter cold outside, and we could tell that something just wasn't right in the house that morning when we left for school. We came home from school that day, still really none the wiser of what happened, but I have a vivid memory where we saw press outside the house and I just turned round and walked away. I think it was just dread in the pit of my stomach that even at 6 years old, I think I knew something bad had happened. Didn't know what had happened, but we knew that Vicky was gone. She didn't come home. Mum was distraught. There was police at the door and reporters outside. Back then, I knew that that was it. Life had changed forever.
In February '91, I was working at the Daily Record's office in Edinburgh. The Record at the time was the biggest selling newspaper in Scotland by a long way. It was a big newspaper, big staff. Smoke in the air, TVs on, there was people talking with phones. It was certainly not a library, that's for certain. It was a big, bustling newsroom every day. Back then, most families bought at least one newspaper a day, and sometimes they would buy a daily paper and an evening paper. The Daily Record at the time sold just under 800,000 a day. These days, the whole Scottish newspaper market is lucky if it totals 400,000 a day, and that's the whole market. So it's changed dramatically. People just had this thirst for news.
Police officers have covered the town.
I first heard about the Vicky Hamilton case in the same way as I heard of any other missing person case.
We're very concerned at this point in time, but as each day passes, I become more and more concerned. about Vicky Hamilton.
It wasn't particularly unusual for the police to put out a press release. You'd probably get maybe one a month on somebody who's gone missing. But usually, once the appeal goes out from the police, these cases are solved very, very quickly. But as the days went on and the police kept asking for information, it became clear that perhaps this was going to be a little bit different.
As each day goes past, I lose a bit more faith that she's still alive. I pray to God that she is. I just don't know what else to say. I mean, it's completely baffling what's happened to her.
After Vicky was declared missing, and when the police got involved, the press picked up on it. And my mum and Sharon wanted to do as much press as possible at the time because we wanted it in the forefront of everybody's mind who Vicky was.
Vicky was only 50. You know, she was a kid, you know, and I can see her face still now as clearly as ever in her school uniform with the sort of bob and everything. I have got a school photograph of me, which is very similar to the one of Vicky. It was a classic school photo that kind of any house in Scotland, and I'm sure beyond, would have.
Where we are now is roughly 6 miles from Lockerbie.
Going back to the 90s, I was trying to sort of forge a career as a freelance broadcaster, and I did a variety of different programmes. Life Stories was one of them, and that was where I met Jeanette.
Words can't express it, the feeling that you're going through. Are they going to find your body? Or, you know.
I was very aware at the time of her fragility. You just see a mother who is utterly, utterly bereft at this mysterious disappearance of her daughter.
Oh, for goodness sake, please get in contact with me or the police. Just put me out this hell I'm going through.
And for me, it happened around the Bathgate area. I come from Grangemouth. I mean, I know that part of Scotland extremely well. And for someone just to go missing without any obvious explanation, it was just one of those things that you don't imagine happening in really a pretty quiet, humdrum part of the world.
My stomach just churns when I come out this Bathgate. In such a small area, how she can go missing beyond me.
It is a remarkably short area, isn't it? I mean, that's the bus stop. And then where she came along?
Oh, she took this route, and then she went for some chips before she was to get the connecting bus back to Falkirk.
Now, in Lothian Borders Police at that time, we were very alert to child abduction. But there were very real issues to that scenario because the roads were so bad that night that hardly any vehicles were able to move. And all the side roads, and Bathgate is surrounded by little side roads that go through bogs and swamps and wooded areas, all of which are incredibly difficult to search, even on a good day. Vehicles couldn't have got up these roads because they were closed because of ice and snow. So Bathgate was isolated, as it were. It was cut off, really, apart from the odd bus.
And that's when it became extremely serious, that Vicky had just basically vanished into thin air, and they realised that this was going to be a big missing persons case.
Within, I think it was a week, we started to do a systematic house search from the point she was last seen, using the old-fashioned bullseye principle, starting at the middle and working outward. We started to do a systematic house search of every property in Bathgate, whether it be commercial or private, including garden sheds, garages, factories, storage areas, you name it. We were going to search them all systematically.
The scale of the police operation was huge. There was underwater teams. I'm sure there was helicopters up at the time. Every possible sighting, every tip-off they had, they would act on because they were desperate to find out where she was. But it was a bit of a needle in the haystack because she was last seen at a bus station. Where did she go from there? It was very difficult, and it became a thing. You know, the hunt for Vicky Hamilton became a big story. It was on the front pages a lot, and people were desperate to find out what happened to her. I think people at the time were captured by the mystery of it, and it would resonate with any parent.
Vicky was everybody's wee sister, everybody's wee neighbour, and she just disappeared off the face of the earth in the most mysterious circumstances on a terrible, dark, cold winter night.
Police say it's baffling that there have been no sightings at all of the 15-year-old schoolgirl since she vanished 12 days ago. And they say they've now no option but to look on the bleak side.
We've reached a stage of the inquiry where we actually fear the worst. And despite an intensive police inquiry and an extensive search, that has thrown up nothing which would be of importance to the inquiry.
What are you saying to the family and relatives of Vicky now?
We are saying to the family and relatives, we are still looking for Vicky. We still have hopes, but we are preparing ourselves for the worst.
In 1977, we'd had the abduction of Helen Scott and Christine Eady, the so-called World's End murders, where two young girls, not much older than Vicky, had been abducted and murdered. A few years later, we'd had the abduction and murder of two children, Caroline Hogg and Susan Maxwell. And there was a sense of, oh, not again. Not again. Not another wee girl. We've lost too many children.
Nobody knew what happened with Vicky. And then her purse was found in St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh.
Vicky Hamilton's purse was found here in Edinburgh. It had apparently been thrown to the ground, and that's deeply worrying for the police.
The finding of the purse suggests that it was there no longer than the Wednesday evening, and certainly it was not there from the time of her disappearance. How it got there is a matter under investigation at the moment.
Now, this was the first breakthrough. This was the first recovery of any physical evidence that related to Vicky. And the implication was clear, that she was a runaway and that she tried to ditch her old identity by chucking her purse and getting a bus to who knows where. That was clearly what we were meant to believe.
The onus shifted to, had she run away? Had she just had enough and went to London, because there was a bus link to London at St Andrew's Square at that time. And I think that put a big dampener on my mum, thinking that, yeah, on one hand, it was good she'd ran away, she was still alive. But another time it was like, well, why has she ran away?
It raised so many questions, but unfortunately didn't really give any answers. It was obviously tested in the early days, but didn't really show up any matches, I think, apart from Vicky's own at the time.
There was a lot of discussion about it, and of course we had to think about the hypothesis. We could not ignore the fact that this had happened.
What really strikes me now is how quick we were to sort of go with the theory that Vicky had, of her own volition, disappeared and headed off to the bright lights and voluntarily become a missing person. But actually, was that just an excuse for sort of, you know, not being able to deal with it? Particularly when Jeanette herself was convinced that Vicky wouldn't have done that.
There's no way in my mind that she would have gone to London. Why are you so convinced of that? Because I know my daughter. I mean, she's not a loner. The only way I can come to terms with that fact is that she's got involved with somebody. That's the only way I can come to terms with that. Because she's just not that type of person.
You know, when I look back on that documentary now, I'm sort of chastising myself for the way that I was approaching Jeanette, because, of course, I didn't have kids. I was in my late 20s. I probably didn't have as good of an understanding as I should have had of the situation that she found herself in.
I mean, does it worry you that maybe you didn't know her as well as you thought you did? I mean, is it...
No, I mean, if Vicky's still alive, I'll be very happy. I just don't feel that's the case.
If Vicky is alive, even if it meant that she had gone off and she had put you through this trauma and all the rest of it, you could still deal with that.
Well, at least if she's alive, that must be the main thing. If she's alive and well, I can accept that. It's a little ray of hope, but I still believe within my heart that if Vicky was able to get in contact, she would have done so.
At that time, I think the families of those people who just went missing were just left with an absolute vacuum. You know, there really wasn't any great agency to help people who were left in that void. And I mean, I think when the Missing Persons Helpline came in, it did a lot to kind of fill that void and made a big difference. And I know for Jeanette, that was a really important thing for her.
In the early 90s, I heard about an organisation that was just starting. At that stage, it was called the National Missing Persons Helpline. There was this huge need to support families who had missing relatives. So I went just to volunteer to help out.
Would you like me to give you the number?
People would ring us with information, sightings, possible news on the person's whereabouts, which we would then pass on to the police. This was a big open plan office. Banks of telephones where case managers and volunteers would be taking calls. It was not a quiet office. The phone was going the whole time. There was such a big problem, and I immediately became totally immersed in the cause.
So, but this isn't the first time you've seen him in that pub?
People go missing for all sorts of reasons. It could be a young person who's run away, it could be someone who's depressed, old people with dementia. Occasionally we'd be able to write "found" across the poster, which was obviously a good feeling.
And we're also getting calls from missing people themselves, ringing up saying, I would like to make contact with my family, can you help me?
So initially it started just as a helpline, but we felt, well, we can do more than just listen to these people talking. We can actually get out there and do stuff and help find these people. So we would make missing person posters. We would go out on the streets and distribute these. We'd also work very closely with what was in those days called the Juvenile Protection Unit, who were a section of the police force who would go around looking for runaways.
We'll get people that have run away from school, run away from home, or have just come up for the day without the knowledge of their parents or families. The problem is immense, and we're only scratching the surface of it.
We also did more unusual things, like we put pictures of missing people on the side of milk cartons.
The scheme will be judged to have been a success if it helps to reduce Britain's large population of missing people.
We were very proactive in talking to the media, trying to get different outlets to let us put appeals in their newspapers or magazines. This is from The Guardian, another big feature talking about Britain's 200 missing people. That's Vicky. Vicky Hamilton, she was very much a case that I was aware of. The circumstances of her disappearance we felt were very concerning, and I remember we did a lot of work on the case. Any opportunity we had to publicise her picture, we would always do that. She even featured in a pop video by a band called Soul Asylum. The video featured many of our missing persons. The song was released in the UK, and my job was to contact all of the families, explain what was happening, and ask if they would like their missing loved one to be featured. And I'm pretty sure almost all the families I contacted jumped at the chance. And there's Vicky. There's Dinah. Most young people who run away turn up very quickly. Suspicious missing persons, cases like Dinah and Vicky, are the exception.
3 police forces are combining resources to search common land in Hampshire for a missing Essex teenager. 18-year-old Dinah McNichol from Tillingham near Malden disappeared after attending a rock concert.
Dinah McNichol, who went missing in August '91, so a few months after Vicky, her father contacted us very early on. He was very proactive. I used to speak to him a lot.
Not knowing is terrible. It's been crucifying.
Police officers and soldiers set out early in the morning. Ahead of them, an inch-by-inch search of 500 acres of wasteland. Police fear she's either dead or has been persuaded to join a religious sect and is being held against her will. For Dinah's father, the search could bring an end to the anguish of not knowing what has happened to his daughter.
The photograph we had of Dinah was a photo booth photograph. And it was a very haunting picture with her hair and these beautiful eyes looking out at the camera. From what Ian told me, Dinah was quite a free spirit. She was interested in music. She liked going to festivals. I think she liked rave music. I think she was quite an artistic person. Ian himself was a jazz musician, so there was obviously that creative streak in the whole family.
Dinah, who's just 4 feet 10 inches tall, is an enthusiastic student. Awaiting her at home are her A-level results and offers of places at 2 universities and numerous colleges.
She disappeared after having gone to a festival. But I remember her father telling me that he wasn't that happy about Dinah going to that festival. She was just 18. He wanted to give her independence, although he was a little anxious, and sadly, he was right to be anxious. For us, our role was just to make sure everyone knew that Dinah was missing. She appeared in the big issue. She was put on the side of a milk cart, and she appeared on various TV programmes.
Crime Watch doesn't make appeals for missing persons. If someone chooses to make off without telling family or friends, well, you know, it may be reckless, selfish, thoughtless of the worry that they'll have caused, but it's not a crime. Tonight, though, I'm asking one person, please call home. Dinah McNichol, if you're watching, will you call your father, your grandma, or Sarah? All they want to hear is that you're alive and well.
In 1980, her mother was killed in a traffic accident. She was forced to grow up rather quickly. She wanted to get her A-levels and go to college or university.
On her 18th birthday, Dinah became entitled to £2,000. It was compensation for her mother's death. Dinah put it in a building society and then resisted all temptation to draw on it.
After the festival, she decided to hitchhike back with a friend.
Oh, that concert was brilliant, wasn't it? I mean, I've never been.
As far as I can remember, the driver had sort of straw-coloured, wavy hair.
He got out earlier, and then she was heading on back home, but obviously she never made it home.
We are desperately concerned, and we do feel that there is a strong possibility that something has happened to
Now,
her.
one of the clues is that £2,000 that she got as compensation for her mother's death, that she guarded so carefully, all of that has been withdrawn.
With the exception of about £100 odd, yes, it was withdrawn at 13 locations around the south coast.
I do know that she'd set that money aside. It wasn't money that she was spending. She was going to use it for her education or for travelling. So it was definitely suspicious when it was seen to be leaving her bank account.
Mr. McNichol had admitted at a news conference that hopes of finding Dinah alive have faded with time.
Are you saying that you have in a way resigned yourself to the fact that she probably isn't still alive?
Yeah. I've had to come to terms with that. Otherwise, I don't think I would be able to keep my own sanity. It's the not knowing is the worst part.
And to Dinah herself?
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to come. We all miss you.
It is definitely pretty much the worst thing any parent can go through, having a missing child. And that's another reason why our organisation was so important, because we just kept in touch with these families and tried to offer support.
The sense of not knowing, that's a form of torture, isn't it? Can you imagine going to sleep every night and your daughter is out there somewhere? You do not know what has happened to her. You don't know what's befallen her. Your head is going to go everywhere.
When Vicky vanished, me and Lee were only 6, so the family tried to hide it from us, but they couldn't hide what was happening to Mum. My mum was always a lovely, bubbly person, and then just overnight that changed. She was no longer that lovely, bubbly person. She was extremely worried all the time, very nervous. She started drinking. It was her way of coping. She just became very introverted, didn't ever want to leave the house because she was just scared of what the outside world was going to do.
Every member of Vicky's family were desperate to get as much information as possible. Both Vicky's mum, Jeanette, and her dad, the couple were estranged, but her dad, Michael, were very, very keen to make public appeals, to speak to the press, to do as much as they could to raise the profile of the case. But inevitably, most of the appeal was done through Vicky's sister Sharon, and that went on over the years.
My sister became the unofficial spokesperson.
I mean, there must have been hundreds of questions going through your mind when this all happened, and since.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much goes through your mind. You go through, is she alive, is she dead? You know, will I see her again? Or who's done this to her? Somebody knows something.
Sharon was quite young and had the energy to do these kind of shows. And she agreed with Mum that the more publicity we could get, the better.
What we did find is most families would do anything. They would do absolutely anything to find their missing loved one. And if that meant putting themselves on camera when they didn't feel comfortable, they'd still do it.
In 1998, I was presenting a show called Lowry. My background is journalism, so the point of the show, each show, was to focus on a different subject.
How would you cope if your child went missing for a day, a year, or even forever? You didn't know where they were, you didn't know who they were with, or even if they were alive or dead.
The challenge would then be to find guests who could talk knowledgeably about that area. So if you're doing a show about missing people, obviously you want the families of the missing people. I think there was a bit of a sea change around crime in general in the 90s, in the sense that it became less an issue of crime and punishment, and more people began to understand the ripples that went out from a crime and the effect on people emotionally. And people began to talk about feelings about what had happened to them. So it was a window into their world.
Ian McNichol, your daughter, Dinah, has been missing for how long?
7 years.
That is a long time. Such a long time. Tell us what happened. Have you had any reports about how she came to disappear?
No, it started off as a happy home. She was doing her A-levels, studying 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. When it all finished, she asked if she could go with her friends to a pop festival.
What I think's really clear when you watch this is how fragile Ian McNichol is.
When you discovered she was genuinely missing, presumably initial panic-stricken...
You don't believe it. You actually do not believe it.
But you've now had 7 years of not knowing what's happened to your daughters. What does that do to you?
Destroys you. Yeah.
Why?
Because if she's dead, you can mourn. But because she's missing, you can't mourn.
His eyes are so sad in this. He looks, you know, that phrase, a husk of a person, he looks sort of exhausted, and he said 7 years of having to live with this.
Thank you. Sharon, your sister Vicky has also been missing for 7 years. Have you also felt that kind of limbo that Ian's talking about?
Personally, I was in limbo for about 2 to 3 years, and then I came to terms with family matters that Vicky had been murdered. So
you think she's dead now?
Yes, I feel she's been abducted and she's been murdered. There's so much that's went on in our family in 7 years that Vicky was such a caring person. If she knew, there was a big run of press in Scotland, and if she saw that, she would have been home. So that's why I know that something terrible's happened to her.
Watching this now, Vicky's sister, her attitude is very different. She's kind of come out fighting. You come on a show like this because you want to highlight the case, because you want, number one, to tell the police that you still want them to investigate, even though it's been many years. And number two, you're hoping for any leads. People might be watching, they might remember something. And then as she talks, you begin to see, I think, the sadness and begin to come through in her.
I thought she'd run away, though.
How did her disappearance affect your mother?
It took 2 years, but it killed her.
It killed her?
It killed my mother. And I really...
What did she die of?
She died of depression, a broken heart.
Did she always expect to get a message, to get a phone call, something?
Yes. Oh, yes. For the first 3 months, my mum never left the house. She wouldn't step over our doorstep. If the phone went, run at the phone. If a car pulled up, she was out the window. She did try to go on for the sake of her 7-year-old twins, but it just, in the end, it just got the better of her. She just died.
I just feel so sad for those families that I. And perhaps now because I've got my own daughter who's 17, maybe that's why I look at it now in a different way. And it makes me angry, makes me sad and angry that those families, you know, in a way that I hadn't realised I would feel when I watched it, but I do feel that now, yeah, I do, so.
So here's a longer look at the pictures of Dinah McNichol and Vicky Hamilton.
And we are all members of a special club that nobody wants to be in.
And what is strange now is that back then, none of us had any idea how inextricably linked those two families would become.
When Mum died, my sister took me and Lee in.
Lee.
We didn't change school straight away, but obviously everybody at school knew what was going on, and everybody's attitude towards me changed and towards Lee, and it's really weird to explain to people how that feels, but it was something like, well, can we not just go back to how things were? Everywhere we went, it was always, have you heard any news about Vicky? So a huge ripple effect. We'd lost our sister, we'd lost our mum, we'd had to move house, so we left our childhood home with all the happy memories. We had ended up changing school, and we ended up changing our name. Our lives completely turned upside down because of what had happened.
The Vicky Hamilton case went on for many, many years. And obviously in the early days, there was a real flurry of activity from the police, from press. It was in the news all the time. But inevitably, when the trail goes cold in cases like this, it's harder and harder to keep that case in the public domain and to prick the public conscience about it. It's very, very difficult if there's just nothing happening. And it did dry up for many years. Things took a dramatic turn 15 years after Vicky originally went missing, when a young Polish student called Angelika Kluk disappeared.
Detectives in Glasgow are growing increasingly concerned for a missing Polish student. Angelika Kluk, who was on a working holiday in the city, was last seen on Sunday. Police say her disappearance is totally out of character.
I didn't know Angelika personally, but I do remember that time. I was back in 2006 and she was 23. So at that point, she was only 1 year older than me. So she was just the same young person that I was. Poland joined the European Union back in 2004, and at that point, Poland was in a totally different economic and social position. There was still difficulties in terms of like economics and struggle.
Now the final countdown to the European Union's biggest ever expansion is only 11 hours away. Tony Blair has welcomed the move towards expansion, claiming that a bigger Europe will be good for British jobs, security and prosperity.
When I first came to Glasgow, I just came for summer. And I just came to earn a little bit of extra money to finish my study. And that was just a good opportunity. And I wanted to learn a little bit of the language and I wanted to see Scotland. And I think that a lot of young people at that point from Poland were also looking for these options. And Scotland was the place to do that. So there's a huge increase in number of Poles coming to UK and Scotland at that point.
Fears are growing for the safety of a young Polish woman who's been missing for 3 days. 23-year-old student Angelika Kluk was last seen in the grounds of St Patrick's Church in the Anderston area of Glasgow on Sunday.
Angelika was staying in the chapel house of St Patrick's Roman Catholic Church. It was her second summer there, on vacation from university in Poland.
This was a whole new family that she had. She integrated herself into the family well. She was a very devout Catholic, would come to Mass. She didn't drink, she didn't smoke. She was very conscious of what she ate. She was into keeping fit and sensible, wise and sensible young lady.
When she was last seen, she was wearing the pink top she's pictured in here. She had been employed as a cleaner over the summer, and when she didn't turn up for work on Tuesday, that's so out of character, concern for her safety grew.
It was very much in the news and in the media, and because also locally everyone was talking about that. I do very much remember her sister looking for her.
If there is anything, a small thing, something you think it's not important at all, please get in touch with police. Anything could help at this very point. We do not know anything of her whereabouts. She would not leave without notifying anybody. She doesn't do anything stupid or irresponsible or crazy. She's just too serious for that.
One thing occurred to me that potentially could be some form of accident. Maybe she fell somewhere, or maybe she'd been, I don't know, involved in a car accident or something. I think that the church plays a huge role in terms of her being there. Majority of Polish people are Catholic. So if you feel a little bit homesick, that gives you a little bit of comfort. Angelika was Catholic. She chose this place for safety, and she chose the church, I believe, also for some kind of comfort in a foreign country.
Right at the very start, nobody particularly knew how serious this incident would eventually become and what a big story it was going to be. But because it was a woman from Poland, very young, vulnerable, there was a lot of interest into what had happened to her. She was staying at St Patrick's in Anderston, and that was a very, very unusual part of the story.
She was a lovely girl, very
Sorry,
serious.
she is a lovely girl.
Oh,
I'm so sorry. No, me too. My fault, I led you into that one. So you are obviously very close to Angela.
Yes, because when she came here, this was like her home.
The first time I heard the name Angelika Kluk, I was on call for the week, and I was told that this young girl had gone missing from a church. She'd been living there and working there. So I was asked to go and look at the church just to see, was there any sign of a disturbance, any sign of foul play. So I had a look around the living quarters, looked at Angelika's bedroom. There was nothing out of place, nothing out of sorts. There was certainly nothing that I would have said, someone's been attacked in here or someone's injured or bleeding. As far as I was concerned at that moment, she was a young woman who had disappeared along with someone called Patrick McLaughlin, who was a caretaker in the church.
People had told us about a man called Patrick McLaughlin.
Pat's a handyman. He just finished painting the kitchen. He was up on the roof there, and he was amazing.
The way he was described by the locals was that he was quite a slight man, an older man, quite religious.
He felt at home here too, but I really knew nothing other. In fact, it was only the last few days I learnt his second name.
So when we were asking everyone about McLaughlin, nobody seemed to know where he'd gone. He had disappeared at exactly the same time as Angelica had disappeared.
Is it unusual that he hasn't?
Well, I'm surprised that he hasn't come back.
When you've been a reporter for as long as I have and covered as many crime stories, that's obviously a huge red flag. So everybody wanted to know where this Pat McLaughlin was. Why was he missing?
In 2006, I was a senior investigating officer that dealt with complex investigations, murder inquiries, and I got a telephone call from the Chief Constable, the highest level in the force. This was now a high-risk missing person. There was concerns that Angelica had come to some sort of harm. The last person she had been with was the church handyman, a person called Patrick McLaughlin.
Well, today, detectives released a photograph of a man they want to talk to.
Pat McLaughlin did speak to the police very early on in the investigation, but the police are very anxious to speak to him again and have not so far been able to contact him.
Someone in Paisley recognised the picture and called the police and told them that's not Patrick McLaughlin.
So I went to the press conference, and I can remember it clearly. It was becoming breaking news.
As a result of the response to the media coverage, it has now been established that the man we have been looking for, Patrick McLaughlin, is in fact now believed to be Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a registered sex offender.
So the last person she was seen with was a registered sex offender?
That's what the statement has just said, yes. Huge, huge issues. The police have lost a sex offender. But the big issue is, where is Tobin? Where is she?
Right away, we were able to check, through sources, that this was a man with a serious criminal past.
August 1993, Tobin had invited two 14-year-old girls into his flat in Portsmouth, plied them with drink and drugs. He raped one and indecently assaulted the other and put them through 16 hours of hell.
Well, Peter Tobin, 60 years old, and the police say that he shouldn't be approached.
Angelica could be still in that church, and that was the big concerns.
The police then requested that we go down and look at the last area that Angelica was seen, which was within the garage of the church. And it was a garage that was full of stuff, full of furniture, paint tins, DIY bits and pieces. It was a concrete floor, and we had a look at the concrete floor. And then we just started seeing all these blood spots, and we started circling them and circling them. The size of the blood spots, the distribution of the blood spots, immediately as forensic scientists said to us, someone has been assaulted within this garage.
Up until that point, it was a missing person investigation. And the church had been searched, but not on the same criteria. So I used the top level of expertise. The Pulse are search advisors, and they were briefed to search that church. Leave no stone unturned, in fact, rip that place to shreds if need be. And within 3 hours, the Pulsar team had found a woman's body underneath the floor of the church. There had been like a small sort of trapdoor. And underneath there was a body of a woman. She had sustained extensive injuries, horrible, horrible injuries. She was unidentifiable.
Hello, good afternoon. Police investigating the disappearance of a Polish student in Glasgow say they expect a body which was found hidden in a church to be identified later today.
When we found out, our immediate move was to get right down there to the church and see what was going on.
The religion seems to hide quite a lot of sins, as they say.
Where was the father of the chapel when all this happened? You think he would have saw something, wouldn't you?
People were wondering, how could this have happened in a church of all places?
You know, it's supposed to be the safest, one of the safest places on earth, and yet this poor girl had clearly lost her life here.
Okay, afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming this afternoon. As you will be aware, the body that was found within St Patrick's Church at William Street in Anderson on Friday evening was that of Angelika Kluk, the missing Polish student. Sadly, I have to inform you that following the post-mortem examination this afternoon, Angelika's death has now been treated as murder.
When these horrors unfold in front of you, it's quite difficult. You've got to try and retain your professionalism. I sat and watched for some time as Carol Rogers, went in and out the place. She was obviously working underneath the floorboards, looking to see what evidence she could get from poor Angelika's body.
I think Angelika's scene felt different in that it was a young woman. The majority of murders I'd been out to at that point, and probably since that point, are men. The prospect of going down under the floorboards filled me with dread, to be honest. I knew how tight it was going to be, and to be honest, I didn't think I'd be able to fit. It was immediately apparent to me that this was a sexually motivated murder, and it was also apparent that Angelika had been bleeding. There was quite a lot of blood round about her hands and the parts of her body I could see. So, in my mind, I wanted to examine her body without moving her.
Experts are important to piece it together because the victim has no voice. So Carol advised, don't move the body.
The main reason for that is that as soon as that body is moved, as soon as she's moved, put in a body bag, the body fluids are going to start to redistribute, they're going to move about. That can change opinions we're able to give in court further down the line, and it can also contaminate any trace evidence that is on her body.
And what Carol did was unbelievable. Carol lay under the floor beside the body and took forensic samples.
I knew I was going to be down there for a while because I knew there was going to be quite a lot of evidence to recover. I ended up being down there for 3.5 hours. It's very hard to distance yourself because at the end of the day, you're fully aware this is a young woman that is very much loved. This is someone who something really terrible has happened to. But you're also thinking professionally, I need to get the best evidence here. I need to do my best job because at the end of the day, someone has to be accountable for this and there has to be justice for this young woman's family.
The last person Angelika Kluk was with is Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender. It's a major investigation. Where's Tobin? We know he left the church in the early hours of the morning. He left the church very quickly.
This was someone who was on the run, and there was someone who was obviously dangerous, and he needed to be caught.
There's a figure on CCTV going out the back of the church, and he goes to a bus station in Edinburgh. He gets a bus from that bus station, the Edinburgh bus station, down to London.
I'm a neurologist. I work at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in central London. I received a phone call that weekend as the on-call consultant for the stroke service about a patient known as James Kelly had been admitted to the hospital with symptoms suggestive of a stroke. And when the junior doctor who had admitted the patient returned home, they were watching the news and had a realisation that the person on the news was in fact identical in appearance to the patient that she'd admitted, known as James Kelly. It was a manhunt for Britain's most wanted man.
Tobin had turned up in a hospital in London. He had admitted himself to feigning illness, and he had claimed that he was someone called James Kelly.
So the police were called in, and I came in to see the patient. And I said to Mr. Tobin that my opinion was that he hadn't had a stroke and that police were waiting to take him away, and I was going to instruct them that that was fine from a medical perspective. Most patients, if they're confronted with the thought that their illness is in some way put on, will become very angry. And his response was very unusual. And he said to me, well, doctor, if that's what you say, then I suppose that must be true then.
Strathclyde officers are in London tonight and are expected to bring Mr Tobin back to Glasgow.
So when we first went down into the hatch, looking at Angelica's injuries, it was apparent to me, even as someone who's not a pathologist, that this was a violent death. She'd been stabbed multiple times. Her hands were bound. She had a gag in her mouth. She had tape wrapped around her face. Her clothing was on, but her upper clothing was pushed up and her trousers were unfastened. So it all sort of backed up that this was a sexually motivated murder, and you could see the extent of the violence as well at this point.
As soon as I saw what Tobin had done to Angelica, I thought, he's 60 years of age. This is not the first time he is killed.
The case of Peter Tobin was unique in many ways. He was the most evil and wicked man that I've ever had to cross swords with in a criminal court.
I need to look at his whole life, go right back to when he was born and see what else he's done. And it was very difficult to piece that life together, because this is someone that travelled throughout the UK, that used lots of addresses.
All of this behaviour strikes me as somebody who is calm and calculated, as opposed to being frantic or scared.
We don't know. Sorry, I can't help you.
And of course, all of that is one of the key features of being a psychopath.
It soon became missing people that we're looking at.
35 items of jewellery were found in Tobin's possession.
The police were wondering whether these were trophies for a serial killer.
Nobody expected what happened. Nobody.
Please let it be Diana.
You know, as a reporter, you know it's a news story. You're there to do your job, but it was very upsetting.
We just all burst into tears. And then they managed to find fingerprints on the bin bags. Nobody knew what had happened with Vicky. She just was at the bus stop 1 minute and then wasn't at the bus stop.
You want to know if she's alive or if she's dead.
Your sister Vicky, how did her disappearance affect your mother?
It took 2 years, but it killed her.
Back then, none of us had any idea how inextricably linked those two families would become.
We are members of a special club nobody wants to be in.
Fears are growing for the safety of a young Polish woman who's been missing for 3 days.
Right at the very start, nobody knew what a big story it was going to be.
As you will be aware, the body that was found within St Patrick's Church was that of Angelica Klook.
The prospect of going down under the floorboards filled me with dread, to be honest.
Sadly, I have to inform you, Angelica's death has now been treated as murder.
It was immediately apparent to me that this was a sexually motivated murder.
Well, today, detectives released a photograph of a man they want to talk to.
Peter Tobin.
Peter Tobin.
Peter Tobin, a volunteer worker at Angelica's church, was arrested in London.
As soon as I saw what Tobin had done to Angelica, I thought, he's 60 years of age. This is not the first time he is killed.
This is a Scotland Yard murder bag. It's been at the scene of violent death hundreds of times. Now, although the murder squad itself was formed in 1906, over the past 5 years, the success rate has been 95%. What do you put that down to, Inspector?
Well, as the years pass, forensic science becomes better and better, and the fingerprint departments are becoming better and better. We can solve murders today which maybe 50 years ago would have been unsolvable purely from the scientific angle.
My specialism is in the recovery of fingerprints. That's been happening for over 100 years. Started off with powders, but what we do is much more scientific and much more based on a better understanding of what's happening both within the fingerprint and what is potentially present. Effectively, there are friction ridges on your hands and your feet, and as you sweat, the sweat sticks to the ridges, and when you touch a surface, you leave an invisible or latent impression. Sweat is 99% water, with the other 1 or 2% being different chemicals and compounds, and those are the things that we target. Those chemicals have an interaction with the surface in a manner that you can potentially recover any fingerprints on those surfaces. Almost like the ghost impression of where those fingers had touched. There are circumstances where fingerprints can last for a significant number of years, and that's why we still look at items for cold cases. It is a huge buzz when you find something that helps paint a picture or helps add to a story, particularly when that story is pointing towards a serial killer.
The investigation into the murder of the Polish student Angelika Kluk is continuing tonight. Major forensic work has been underway since the body of the 23-year-old was found hidden beneath the floorboards of the church.
So he was brought back to Scotland. And then, later on in that week, we got the DNA identification.
We searched the Scottish DNA database first and we got no match at all. So we then searched the national DNA database and that's when we got a named match. And the match came back against Peter Tobin.
That is the start, because you have to think ahead. And they knew what would come up at the court. Consensual sexual intercourse, that's why his DNA would be there. So you had to go and prove beyond reasonable doubt that Tobin had killed Angelika.
We've established where Angelika had been murdered, which was within the garage of the church, but we never established a pool of blood. We couldn't pinpoint the exact area she must have been lying and bleeding. And we couldn't work out how she got down the hatch without any blood getting transferred onto the hatch because it's such a tight space. Her body was actually wrapped in a tarpaulin. So the tarpaulin became really interesting.
The tarpaulin was submitted to us after the biological samples had been taken off it to recover the fingerprints from it. So we did recover fingerprints, we photographed them, and then we send the file and a print.
What the machine does, it allows us to put the image of the mark that we want to look at underneath, and it brings it up on this plate here. The other side is the fingerprint form taken from the suspect or the accused. To identify this mark as having been made by this person, we have to find sufficient characteristics in each of the marks which appear in the same place on each. And the one that looks as if it's quite busy with characteristics, and I'm looking at ridges here, and we always go from one side to the other side.
There was a significant number of fingerprints found that were subsequently identified to Peter Tobin. None of them were particularly significant in terms of the position of them. There was just so many of them, but that in itself, being so many belonging to Peter Tobin and little or none belonging to anyone else, was in itself reasonably significant.
During the post-mortem, there'd been small bits of wood found in Angelika's skull. And we had a table leg submitted into the laboratory for examination. There was 4 of them. One of them did have blood. We sampled that. It matched Angelika Kluk's DNA profile. So we were able to give the opinion that in the whole context of everything, most likely this had been the weapon used to strike her.
There was an overwhelming forensic case against Tobin starting to build up. We had his fingerprints, his blood-stained clothing. There was some DNA, some blood on the watch that he still had on him.
So there was a lot of evidence of her on him and him on her. So really powerful stuff.
A man appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court this afternoon charged with the murder of Angelika Kluk. Peter Tobin, who's 60, also faces 2 further charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Peter Tobin made no plea or declaration and was remanded in custody.
It was horrible, tragic story of someone like me who moved to Glasgow from Poland and just happened to be in the wrong place.
Tonight in Glasgow, a Catholic Mass for a Polish community grieving the loss of one of their own. The murder of a young student from Gdansk has shocked many.
I think that being a woman and being a migrant adds a lot of vulnerability to your status. She was in a very safe environment, perceived safe environment. She was in the church, and someone asked her for a favor. He was a handyman in a religious community when everyone should feel safe. Surely you will help him because you don't want to be perceived as one of the migrants who is a scrounger, who is being described in the media. And I think that adds to Angelika's vulnerability.
Her sister said Angelika had an extraordinary enthusiasm for life.
I hope that those who met her, had contact with her, will remember her by that. That she was able to pass on that enthusiasm. And in that way, she won't die in your memory. And this is really important to me and to my dad.
So we had Peter Tobin for murder. But as soon as I saw the ferocity of what he'd done and how confident he was that he'd remained at that scene for 2 days, he even gave a statement to the police using his alias, Patrick McLaughlin. How calm and cool is that? That's just someone that was organised. And I thought, we've got to look at this individual's life. He's killed before. So Operation Anagram was a very confidential setup. It was a locked room with a team of detectives working away to look at Tobin's whole life, go right back to when he was born and see what else he's done. We traced a lot of his partners, his former wives. His first wife, Margaret, you know, when Margaret talks about what happened to her, she lived a life of hell.
A psychiatrist is a medical doctor that deals with mental illness, and a forensic psychiatrist does that, but specifically with individuals that have a history of violence or offending. So we tend to assess people in courts, in locked psychiatric units, and also in prisons. So when you look at any individual that commits repeated severe violence, that usually is related to a number of factors. Firstly, it's about their own experiences in childhood and adolescence, and a large proportion of these people, who are mostly men, just show the huge lack of empathy. And it also tells us a bit about their personalities. They tend to be quite impulsive, they tend to be quite aggressive, and it also tells us about how they view dynamics in a relationship. So Tobin's wife, Margaret, was very young and very vulnerable when they first met. She was only 17.
When you first met Peter Tobin, he appeared on a visit very charming. I mean, you were pretty much swept off your feet in a sense.
That's correct, yes. He was very gentlemanly. He dressed very nice in a suit, and he just had very good conversation.
But after you've been out with him for some time, you saw the darker side of him. How did that manifest itself?
So we went up this flat, and then I said, I have to go now, thank you very much, and will I see you again? So I made towards the front door, and he followed in behind me, and then just suddenly as I opened the door, he just slammed it shut and said, no, you're not leaving here. And he just pulled me by the arm and pushed me over into the middle of the floor.
One thing that really stands out is that he's actually quite charming when he first meets his victims, and then he gets them into a scenario or a situation where they're vulnerable.
He kept you a prisoner for quite some time.
Yes, for a good few months when I was in that flat. If I tried to get out or tried to call for help, as it was a tenement, he would shut me up, gag me with his hand, or throw me down on the chair or against a wall.
He controlled different aspects of her life. Not only did he overtly control their interactions by intimidating her, scaring her, and arguing with her, he controlled her ability to literally leave their accommodation and go where she wanted to. So it feels like he tried to almost have a holistic approach in the way that he was controlling her.
He kept a knife.
When he wanted to rape me and I wouldn't consent to it, I eventually got a good dig in the side with a knife.
And I suppose the most serious assault was a very violent assault.
Yes, if it hadn't been for a gentleman below who had seen the blood through his ceiling, I would probably be dead now.
Often when we see domestic violence or any form of severe violence, the reason that there's an escalation is because the perpetrator almost builds up a tolerance. So they need to up the ante, they need to find a higher stimulus to get the same kind of buzz as their first act.
You then went to Brighton, and he forced you to marry him using two of his friends as witnesses because you were at that point still underage under English law.
This all strikes me as somebody who was calm and calculated with a degree of equanimity as opposed to being agitated or scared. And the reason that I think that is clinically significant is that that is one of the key features of being a psychopath.
You started to get a picture of someone that was a controlling individual, someone that was extremely violent. Margaret was a victim of horrendous abuse in the 60s. But it was the 1960s. Where could she go? Where could she get help? Who could she speak to? She had no one to go to.
The wife beater is rarely someone who stands out in a crowd. Most of the women we've spoken to say their friends believed their husbands were charming men.
Husband don't know what he's done. Kids don't know what's wrong with mum. She can't say, they can't see. Putting it down to another bad day.
The problem is one that stretches across the whole social spectrum. And some wives relate a horrifying catalogue of experiences.
So this is how it feels to be lonely. This is how it feels to be small.
Fear is, I used to go to the toilet and be sick. It just were nerves waiting on him coming in.
The scale of the problem was extensive. The United Nations, and we used to use this kind of statistic, would say that maybe between 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women would experience domestic abuse in our lifetime.
Domestic violence, rape, all sorts of crimes against women, they weren't investigated the way they are nowadays.
This is how it feels when your word means nothing at all.
The changes that happened through the 70s and into the 80s that ended up being really quite significant political changes grew out of the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement,
And many of those women were survivors of violence, of domestic violence, and then became drawn into this movement, which was about learning that what happened to them wasn't their fault, their responsibility, as they were so often being told, not only by perpetrators, but by the kind of messaging of wider society.
The woman should always walk on a well-lit side of the street as opposed to a dark area, where she should arrange to walk with friends if she can, where she should arrange to be met from a late-night function. If all those common-sense precautions were to be taken, the vast majority of offences against women would be avoided.
So this is how it feels to be lonely. This is how it feels to be small.
It was really important to challenge the everyday assumptions, this kind of so-called common sense, that the problem was something that women had to address. So what this new campaign wanted to do was really to turn that on its head and say, who causes the problem? It's not the women. It's a social problem. It's a problem about men's behaviour. I think in that original campaign, there were 64 billboards erected on stands on Princess Street, so they were completely unavoidable. They were in a large number of the bus shelters around town. They're all striking images by Frankie Raffles, and this one shows a woman sitting in a nice, comfortable suburban home. She lives with a successful businessman, loving father, and respected member of the community. Last week, he hospitalised her. This poster really was about saying domestic violence isn't something that just happens in certain kinds of houses or to certain kinds of people. Again, nice middle class, comfy house, 2 little girls playing with their toys. By the time they reach 18, one of them will have been subjected to sexual abuse. From flashing to rape, male abuse of power is a crime. The immediate public impact was significant. People were more aware of the issue. We say it is not acceptable. Violence against women is a crime and we should have zero tolerance for that crime. One of the issues that also was on the agenda was that the criminal justice system wasn't solving the problem, it was part of the problem.
The trial has started of a man accused of raping and murdering a Polish student and hiding her body under a church floor. Peter Tobin, who's 60, denies killing Angelika Kluk at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow last year.
His QC Donald Finlay lodged a special defence that Peter Tobin did have sex with Angelika, but it was with her consent.
There were many, many stories that came out during the Peter Tobin trial. Some of them were very, very salacious.
Angelika's sister Agneta arrives at court on a day dominated by sensational claims of sexual promiscuity.
The defence, they were bringing up aspects of her past, the fact that she'd been having an affair with a married man.
Angelika's married lover, Martin McCaskill, told the court about his last text message from Angelika.
And the fact that the priest had been giving her money and giving her his credit card.
Lots of column inches about the kind of person that Angelika Kluk was.
A court's heard that the murdered Polish student Angelika Kluk was having an affair with the priest of the church where her body was found.
Agneta Kluk described the claim as outrageous and untrue.
But Agneta Kluk did say that Father Nugent was an alcoholic who she described as being a Jekyll and Hyde person.
It was classic. People would say she was flirting, she was having an affair with a married man. All of that, you know, all of that kind of attention on her.
In front of me, I have 11 of the headlines talking about her sexuality. It should be about a horrible crime and securing her dignity. And it feels like she was really stripped of that. She was more than this. So I'm not surprised that the dad said that she hasn't been killed once, but she has been killed twice. When she was murdered and when her reputation was destroyed. I cannot even imagine and put myself into a shoe of her dad and her sister, the way that it might make them feel.
Vladislav Kluk left court having told the jury how his daughter Angelika was a brilliant student and devoted Catholic who loved living in Scotland. He last spoke to her 3 days before she went missing.
In this case, it did rest quite heavily on the forensic evidence because there was a lot of forensic evidence. So I ended up spending 2.5 days in the witness box.
The Angelika Kluk murder trial has had forensic evidence linking the Polish student with Peter Tobin, the man accused of her killing.
DNA taken from semen recovered from Miss Kluk's body had been, according to tests, a complete match for Peter Tobin's.
The main thrust of the defence was that Angelika and Peter Tobin had been in a consensual sexual relationship, that they'd had intercourse and he had left her and then someone had come along and murdered her.
The jury's also been told about a fingerprint from Mr Tobin being found on tape used to gag her.
Because it wasn't sticky tape, we knew there was a really good opportunity to recover DNA from that partial mark. And that's what happened.
The probability of the DNA profile originating from another male unrelated to Peter Tobin is estimated to be around 1 in 1 billion.
Peter Tobin has been found guilty of the rape and murder of the Polish student Angelika Kluk at a church in Glasgow last September.
After 6 weeks, the jury took 3.5 hours to decide he was guilty. The killer had shown little emotion. Then, as he left to face a punishment period behind bars of 21 years, Tobin lashed out at the photographer.
I think that was the first time that the public duly got an opportunity to see the real character behind Peter Tobin. It was good to see that he got that justice, because there's no doubt in my mind and in the minds of any of the police officers that had investigated Tobin's past, that he would have gone on to kill and kill and kill again.
The court has been told that the man who murdered the Polish student Angelika Kluk had been on the run from Strathclyde Police for almost a year before he killed her.
My first involvement in the story was I was just asked to look into Peter Tobin's background because he was a sex offender on the run when he killed Angelika Kluk, so I was asked to look at that, what had gone wrong.
Peter Tobin was convicted of raping and murdering Angelika Kluk 3 weeks ago, but for legal reasons, this part of the story could not be told until today. In 1994, Tobin was jailed in England for 14 years for an horrific attack on 2 girls aged 14 and 15.
He abducted 2 teenage girls, got them into his flat.
Police were first alerted when the 2 girls went missing on Wednesday evening. The older girl returned home early the following morning and told her parents that both she and her friend had been sexually assaulted.
He left them with the gas on in the flat. They survived the attack, but it had a dreadful effect on both of them. Tobin went on the run. I think he was on the run for 40 days.
When he was released from jail, Tobin came to live in Paisley. As a registered sex offender, he had to inform the police if he was changing his address. In October 2005, there was an alleged incident involving Tobin and a young woman.
He had been accused of attacking someone, and that's why he went on the run from Paisley. That's why he disappeared and fell off the radar and assumed a false name and ended up in the church where he murdered Angelika Kluk.
The High Court was told the police made extensive inquiries throughout the UK in 2005 and 2006, but they never traced Peter Tobin. It was only after he had murdered Angelika Kluk that they found him hiding in a hospital in London under a false name.
This headline here, The Betrayal of Angelika, and the story describes the catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system, which allowed Peter Tobin to remain on the run for over a year. These registers are there for a reason. They're supposed to protect the public. And we found time and time again that they don't keep tabs on them all, and it allows predators like Tobin to continue to operate and pop up again and again, and operate in one part of the country and pop up in another, where they start all over again.
This is someone that travelled throughout the UK. He was someone that was mobile, someone that used false names. And we started to find out very quickly they had lots of addresses. Everywhere in this map here, the UK, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was working at places where vulnerable people were. And this is an individual that looked respectable, suits and ties, someone that people described as Mr. Nice Guy. He was a groomer. When we looked at his life, we had a timeline where he was at different times, and it soon became missing people that we're looking at. Every single police force in the UK was reviewing their missing people and undetected murders and rapes. If he was in an area, the police force in that area would want to know if he had any connection to their missing people, and they would look at them and review them. Very quickly established that in 1991, Tobin lived at a house, Robertson Avenue in Bathgate. Everyone remembered that that was the time Scotland's highest profile missing person, Vicky Hamilton, had disappeared.
Peter Tobin didn't feature in the original missing person inquiry at all. There was nothing there, and I recall when I went through a lot of the house-to-house side of things, he wasn't the subject of a house-to-house visit either. That area was out with the parameters that they'd decreed at the time, just out with it.
So Lothian Borders Police, they actually reviewed that missing person, and very quickly there was a potential opportunity. When Vicky Hamilton disappeared, her purse had been found at a bus station in Edinburgh.
When we submitted that and a detailed analysis was carried out on the purse, they found traces of saliva, which ultimately was traced and was found out to be the DNA relating to Peter Tobin's son. That was a major surprise. He'd probably been sucking in his mouth the corner of it, and it's from that area there that this DNA came from.
That is familial DNA that links directly to Peter Tobin. That's evidence, 100% evidence to link Tobin to Vicky Hamilton.
When Tobin was brought back to court to be sentenced for going on the run as a registered sex offender, I went along to cover that small part of the story, and while I was there, somebody mentioned to me that they were going to search a house in Bathgate in connection with the disappearance of Vicky Hamilton. And, you know, I was just astonished because it was Vicky Hamilton.
In 2006, when the news broke of a Polish girl going missing in Glasgow, it was just one of these, oh, right, okay, here we go again, switch the news off, because it was just too close to home, a missing girl. And I don't think we really took much notice of it until we got a phone call and they were like, we need to come down and speak to you. And I don't think we quite registered just how serious it was, because I think after 17 years, I think we kind of, as a family, we just assumed that we would never find out what had happened to Vicky. It was just always just going to be a missing persons case.
When Vicky Hamilton disappeared, Peter Tobin was living at Robertson Avenue in Bathgate. The street has been cordoned off as the most detailed, meticulous search of its kind in the history of Lothian and Borders Police gets underway.
It was clearly big news, it was a big story. And in the weeks that followed, the house in Robertson Avenue in Bathgate was searched by Lothian and Borders police.
What came out of that surprised a lot of people. There were lots of personal items relating to Peter Tobin in the attic space, of little relevance from an investigative perspective. However, what the forensic teams did recover was a knife, and that knife, when it was forensically examined, it showed traces, and there was tissues which was identified as being from Vicky Hamilton.
When we saw in the news about the tent going up in his back garden and the forensic scientists in there, I think we collectively knew something had been found. I don't think we were hoping that Vicky would be there. I don't think we really wanted to even just say it out loud what could potentially be happening now. The police couldn't tell us much for obvious reasons.
You could see how the case is now progressing. You're moving away from clearly all thoughts of a missing person inquiry and into a murder victim inquiry.
But we were always worried that, well, without a body, could they convict? We never kind of wanted to hope that something would come from it until she was found.
At that time, inquiries started to look at other missing people, and the focus was on Dinah McNichol. And Dinah McNichol went missing from way down here. She'd been at the Lip Hook Festival. They'd been hitching a lift, got a lift from a Scottish person. The description he gave of the Scottish man fitted Peter Tobin, and the car fitted one of the cars that Tobin had at that time. So start making inquiries, and it was found her bank card had been used at cash machines all the way along the coastal line to get to Kent. Tobin, he had a house at Irvine Drive in Margate in Kent. Officers from the team spoke to neighbours. One of the neighbours actually remembered them. I remember Scottish Pete.
I looked over the fence one day and saw him digging this massive hole in the garden. And I said, "What are you doing, Pete?" He said, "I'm digging a sandpit for the lad when he comes up, somewhere for him to play." And I thought no more of it. I thought, well, that's going to be a big sandpit.
So they put all that together, thought about it very hard, and decided to investigate that house and dig up the back garden.
That was the thing with the Angelica Klook murder and Operation Anagram. There were so many sad twists and turns, things you were never prepared for.
I was aware that they were carrying out the searches in Margate, and when it became known that they'd found human remains, I spoke to someone connected with the police in Edinburgh and asked whether I should go to Margate, and they said yes. I went to Margate that day and drove to Irvine Drive. There was a lot of media there. I seem to remember the weather was pretty bad. You know, when you arrive at something like that and the network television broadcasters are there, you know, it was clear you were walking into a major news story.
I was at college. I was at college and I'd came out of my class and I'd got a phone call saying you have to come to Sharon's right now.
The police in Essex went to Tobin's old house in Margate thinking they might find Dinah McNichol, and to their astonishment and to everyone's astonishment, they found Vicky Hamilton.
We just all burst into tears.
It was just incredible, you know, the idea that Vicky Hamilton, who disappeared in Scotland, this 15-year-old girl, was in the back garden of a house at the other end of the UK. It was just astonishing, mind-blowing, grim. You thought, how on earth, all these years she's been here in somebody's back garden. I remember standing trying to do a live report in Margate and not really knowing what to say.
The house in Urban Drive in Margate is just over 370 miles from where Vicky Hamilton was last seen in the centre of Bathgate in 1991.
When we got told Vicky had been found, it was just shock and complete disbelief. And then once the feelings kind of dissipated, it kind of came to realise, hang on, why is she in a back garden 400 miles away? What had happened for her to be there? And then realisation kind of set in that her final moments must have been horrendous.
You know, it emerged that he must have murdered her in Bathgate, and then a number of weeks later taken her body to the south of England in bin bags in his car.
For years, this hole in the ground has been the resting place of Vicky Hamilton.
Then when the evidence came out about how she had been bisected and how she'd been wrapped up, and that brought up a whole new sense of feelings of, whereas ignorance was maybe a bit bliss, where we could just say she'd went missing. But then realising she had died on February the 10th when she was 15-year-old.
I've lost any faith or track into trying to fathom out the mindset of an individual like Peter Tobin, how they think and what they do. No, there is no formula that you can come up with to work out why they do something and what you can do to countermand that.
It was a very, you know, as a reporter, you're there, you know it's a news story, you're there to do your job, but it was very upsetting. You knew that the family, after all those years of horrible tortures, you know, uncertainty, they had, I don't think closure's ever the right word to use, but they had her back.
There was relief. In fact, it was suddenly good that she'd been found. The end was in sight to the nightmare. We could give her a send-off, we could have a place to say goodbye, and she could finally be with Mum, wherever that is.
For police search teams, this has been a gruelling job.
It has been a long week of intense physical work. The team, encouraged by yesterday's sad discovery, is determined to continue with this for as long as it takes to complete the task we came here to do.
Peter Tobin's former home in Margate will be stripped bare by the police. They still believe the remains of another missing teenager, Dinah McNichol, could be here.
Well, I mean, I'm looking for Dinah McNichol. I came here looking for Dinah McNichol. I had reasons to come here. We found Vicky, but I don't know where Dinah is yet. But clearly, I still think she's linked to this house in some way.
I'd heard Dinah McNichol's dad on the radio. I was down in Margate, heard him on the local radio station. He was Scottish, because I was from a Scottish station. I got in touch with him. So I went to see him, and he was a lovely guy. He was an old jazz musician. That was why Dinah was called Dinah, after Dinah Washington. And we set up to interview in his house. And we were speaking about Dinah, about what she was like and what happened when she went missing and the impact it had on all the family.
When a member of your family actually goes missing, it's 20 times worse than death, because you do not know a thing.
The doorbell went, and it was one of my colleagues from the local ITV station in that part of England who told us that another body had been found.
There's been a significant development here. Another human body has been found. It's been removed to the mortuary this afternoon, where we'll be conducting a post-mortem this evening.
So I said to Ian, look, should we start recording again? And he said, yes, and he sat back down in his armchair. And I said to him something like, the police in the last hour have said that they have definitely found more human remains there.
If they've said that, please be Dinah and get us out of this misery.
To watch a dad who had spent all these years wondering where his daughter was, And he was hoping that she'd be in the back garden of this guy's house. How bad would things have to be that you would hope your daughter was in a murderer's back garden? Because, as he said, it would put them out of their misery finally.
Please let it be Diana.
And I think that encapsulated, the cruelty of Peter Tobin for me, that they put people in these situations where such a horrific, dreadful, just incomprehensibly cruel act gets them in this situation where hearing that they've been found in the back garden in a shallow grave is actually something that they welcome.
All week long they've been searching. Now they've found 2 bodies that may have lain here undisturbed for 16 years until now. And the question being asked here and elsewhere, perhaps louder than ever now, is could there be any more?
The whole thing was just very, very strange and shocking.
More than 17 years after schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton disappeared, a handyman has gone on trial for her murder.
The system in England is different from Scotland. In Scotland, we don't have opening speeches by the prosecution, and there are very strict rules about what the jury can be told about somebody's previous convictions. So when Peter Tobin was put on trial for murdering Vicky Hamilton, the jury wasn't told they'd been convicted of murdering Angelika Kluk. They weren't told that the man in the dock was already a convicted murderer.
It was very nerve-wracking for the family. What if he was found not guilty? And we're right back to square one.
Peter Tobin denies the abduction and murder of Vicky Hamilton. He's lodged a special defensive alibi.
The doubt started to creep in, especially when we heard that he had an alibi, potentially for that night, claiming he wasn't in Bathgate. We were warned that we might not want to sit in when evidence was read about her final moments. And I think collectively as a family we decided no, we had to listen to it.
Members of Vicky Hamilton's family attended the trial today, and it was decided the photographs of what the police discovered were too sensitive to be displayed on television screens around the courtroom. They began by showing a rectangular-shaped hole in the ground. At the bottom of the hole was a layer of concrete. Beneath that, a layer of chalk, and beneath that, 2 black bin bags with something inside. The bin bags were opened, revealing more bags underneath, like a Russian doll. Finally, the last photograph showed a green bag that had been opened to reveal part of a head.
And they actually, 17 years after she was buried, they managed to find fingerprints on the bin bags.
We received 3 black bin bags that Vicky Hamilton had been in. The innermost layer of those bags was really badly contaminated, but the outermost bag was cleanest because there had been less of that contamination from the decomposing body parts, and potentially a fingerprint has survived.
I just remember maybe somebody notifying us that there was some prints coming in that were recovered on items in connection with the recovery of the bodies. The bags obviously being so old, I don't think it was expected that anything would be found on them.
So the particular technique that was used for these black bin bags was a technique called vacuum metal deposition. So I've taken a black bin bag, and to all intents and purposes it didn't look like there was any fingerprints on it. I've put it through the process, found fingerprints, and made the invisible visible. It was a surprise, a very pleasant surprise that we were able to find fingerprints on it at all. And the fact that those fingerprints were subsequently identified to Peter Tobin was very pleasing.
The fingerprints of the man accused of murdering schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton were found on one of the plastic bags containing part of her body. That's the evidence put before a jury at the High Court in Dundee this afternoon.
The overwhelming evidence was he was guilty, but it was still nerve-wracking, thinking there is still a chance. Even if it's not guilty, there could still be a not proven verdict. And then where do we go from there?
Remember the day of the verdict, it was snowing, which is very striking. Everybody remembered that it was snowing when Vicky Hamilton went missing. And we could see the family walking up the hill to the High Court in Dundee through the snow.
Snow was lying as Peter Tobin was brought into court to face justice, just as it was nearly 18 years ago.
I felt physically sick. Part of me even wanted to run away in case it doesn't go the way that we wanted it to go. So when we sat down, they asked the jury if they came up with a verdict. And then when they said guilty, I think first minute, I felt like forever, but I think first minute it was just silence. And then this overwhelming relief, it was over.
Well, there were cheers and shouts as Peter Tobin was convicted of the murder of Vicky Hamilton. It was a great moment of relief for her family, who had waited for many, many years to find out what had happened to their little girl.
I think me and Lee and Sharon just clung to each other and we just burst into tears.
As Tobin left the dock, there was a shout of "Rotten hell."
And then we had to get ready to go out and read the statement. All these flashes of cameras and people shouting at you, and you're trying to act like your whole world hadn't just again changed for like the 5th time.
Justice has prevailed today. We are glad this 17-year-long nightmare has finally come to an end. We are hoping we can now move on as a family and start to remember Vicky as the loving sister she was before she was so tragically and cruelly taken from us. Vicky's abduction also robbed us of our mum Jeanette, who never came to terms with the fact that Vicky never came home that night, and who died of a broken heart 2 years later, never knowing what happened to her daughter.
Reading that statement outside the court was extremely important, and personally it was really important. I don't know if Angelika Kluk's family were watching it.
We would also like to take this opportunity to offer our condolences to the family and friends of Angelika Kluk. They are in our thoughts today, as it was only after her death that we eventually found out what happened to her sister.
We knew their sacrifice.
Vicky was much more than the girl who was abducted and killed by a stranger, or a girl on a missing poster. Our sister was warm, clever, generous, and we will always remember Vicky as she lived, not as she died. Thank you.
It might sound to some people a weird thing, but at the court case, I was fascinated by how the evidence pinpointed Vicky's murderer. How was it still there after 17 years? And I decided at that point that could be something I would like to do. So I went and got my qualifications, which I never thought I would do. And I did part of it to make my mum and Vicky proud. And when I got my qualifications, I decided to stay on. I absolutely loved education, I loved learning, and I found out that that's exactly what Vicky was like. Vicky loved learning, she always had her nose in a book, and I'm exactly the same. Eventually went to university, got my degree, and I went straight into teaching forensic science. So I do teach the next generation about the basics of sciences and principles, about DNA, the history behind fingerprinting. That was the future, in making sure that other families managed to get closure and justice for anything that happened to their loved ones.
The case of Peter Tobin was almost unique in many ways. He was just about the most evil and wicked man that I've ever had to cross swords with in a criminal court, and I've done over 100 murder cases. He seemed to have absolutely no morals, no remorse, and we can only conclude murdered for pleasure.
I think the way they measure whether you're a serial killer is you have to have 3 victims or more. So when Dinah was found, that meant he had 3 victims. So he was, regarded as a serial killer.
It was not a difficult trial to prosecute. In truth, the evidence was completely and utterly overwhelming. He had a previous conviction for a similar murder, and the body of Diana was found in his garden, where people had seen him at the time of her disappearance digging a hole. I honestly think a law student could have comfortably obtained the conviction of Peter Tobin on the evidence that we had, and it never crossed my mind for a second that he could be acquitted.
I think the jury took 9 minutes to come back with a guilty verdict.
I have never known a verdict in a murder trial returned so quickly. But for the family that was there and throughout the trial, I think there was an element of relief that their ordeal had finally ended, and it was painful to watch them throughout the trial, holding hands and looking at the man who had murdered her.
Peter Tobin, a man already convicted of murdering 2 young women, has been found guilty of a 3rd murder, and police fear he may be linked to dozens of other murders, making him one of the country's worst serial killers.
There was a huge amount of speculation linking him to other missing person cases around the UK, and there was a huge amount of work done to see whether he could be linked to any other missing person cases.
When Peter Tobin left the church in Glasgow, he left in a hurry. He left some of his own belongings aside at the church. And there was a small bag, and in that bag was women's jewellery.
35 items of jewellery were found in Tobin's possession. None of his ex-wives has claimed them.
The police were wondering whether these were, trophies for a serial killer, whether this is things he'd taken from people he'd murdered.
The police passed on items that had been in his possession, and there was female profiles from several of those items, and they were used going forward in Operation Anagram to see if they could be tied up with any missing persons.
The jewellery, the searches in the south of England, and the huge effort that they put into trying to find out whether there were any other victims, unfortunately didn't yield any further results.
And that's the sad thing. I have no doubt he has killed other people. And you always hope one day the DNA profiles may be matched. And I know that Carol still lives in hope.
Since I've been doing this job, the advancements in DNA have been incredible. However, there's still a long way to go. There's even research going on. Can we take a DNA profile and tell what someone would look like? Could you imagine that? What we can do with it now is incredible, but I'm really excited to see what we can do in the future, and the next generation of people doing this job can come and give us the answers that we aren't able to find at the moment.
As journalists, you're supposed to try and keep away from getting too involved in stories. But when you cover something like the crimes of Peter Tobin, I developed a real hatred for him, and when I heard the news that he died, I was pleased. And to be totally honest, I hope it wasn't pleasant for him. I'd seen the impact that his utterly horrific and evil and wicked crimes had on really nice people who didn't deserve it. So I was pleased when he died.
When we look at Peter Tobin as an individual, in all intents and purposes, he comes across as a very ordinary, normal man. So I think it's important that we don't glamorise him or put him up on this pedestal. And we always have to remember the horrendous damage that he did to the victims and their families.
The way I tried to report the story was just try and keep it to the facts and try not forget the victims, because I think there is a tendency in all stories about serial killers to talk about the killer rather than the victims. And they shouldn't be forgotten, should they?
When someone goes missing, everything else changes. There's a huge ripple effect. Looking back, they had their whole life ahead of them, and they were never allowed to grow up. Vicky would be 50 next year. So what would she be? I don't think being a serial killer victim is the legacy that she should have. She's not here, and she should be here, but she was taken from us.